Welcome to the Golden Flower Podcast, a catalyst for your creative life. I'm Angela Levesque, a digital artist, meditation teacher, wordsmith, and transformational guide based in Boise, Idaho.
And I'm Gemma Kaufman. I'm an abstract painter. I'm a creative coach, and I also teach meditation, and I am living in Portugal.
So last episode, we explored the idea of who am I and the idea of essence over form. So if you'd like to check out that, you can go to episode 2. And since essence is such a nebulous concept, we thought it would be a good idea to expand on essence and talk a little bit about how it speaks to us. And so we call this the language of the soul. Because we are a creativity podcast, we want to start off with an excerpt, a passage, a poem that someone has written about a topic that we are about to explore. And so this week, our passage is by Mark Nepo from his work called Unlearning Back to God, Essays on Inwardness, 1985 to 2005. So I actually had the honor of doing a podcast with him maybe like 12 years ago, long time ago. And he just had such a amazing presence. Like, talk about having your whole self in the room. It was warm and inviting, and it was so beautiful. So I'm excited to be able to share some of his wisdom. He, if you're not familiar with his work, is a very famous poet, and he's also written several books, just kind of reflections on life. And so this is kind of one of them. Again, Unlearning Back to God, which I love that name. Each person is born with an unencumbered spot, free of expectation and regret, free of ambition and embarrassment, free of fear and worry, an umbilical spot of grace where we were each first touched by God. In the spot of grace that issues peace, psychologists call this spot the psyche, theologians call it the soul, Jung calls it the seat of the unconscious, Hindu masters call it the Atman, Buddhists call it Dharma, Rilke calls it inwardness, Sufis call it, there's a bunch of words I don't know how to pronounce. Sufis call it Qualab, and Jesus calls it the center of our love. To know this spot of inwardness is to know where we are, not by surface markers of identity, not by where we work or what we wear or how we'd like to be addressed, but by feeling our place in relation to the infinite and by inhabiting it. This is our hard, lifelong task, for the nature of becoming is a constant filming over of where we begin, while the nature of being is a constant erosion of what is not essential. Each of us lives in the midst of this ongoing tension, growing tarnished or covered over, only to be worn back to that incorruptible spot of grace at our core. Regardless of subject matter, this is the only thing worth teaching, how to uncover that original center and how to live there once it's restored. We call that filming over a deadening of heart, and the process of return, whether brought back through suffering or love, is how we unlearn our way back to God. Ooh. What do you think about that?
I mean, thanks for introducing me. This is new terrain for me. So many points. I really like this last bit where he's just picking up on this, uncover the original center, like this kind of return. I mean, there were so many beautiful ways that he described that. I feel like this notion of return is really poignant in what we're going to be talking about today in a way, because there's this kind of sense that a creative journey is like striding ever outwards towards new things. You know, we talk about expanding the edges of our being in this journey, but I think often really it's our creativity which is guiding us home to who we know ourselves to be. We talk about we know ourselves to be at the deep level. I think of this return like that's, what was it? The original center, like before the wounding, before the walls went up, before we made things very complicated. That fullness, that potential I mean, I've definitely experienced a reunion with parts of myself, with no question about it, like through the journey of painting and even through, my voice. But I'd be hard pushed to really be able to explain to you like exactly what I mean by that. Um, but I know that if we were talking about it, you would also know exactly what I'm talking about. It's that thing about when we get into this place where, well, as soon as we start using intangibles, like we know that we're nudging into the terrain of soul language, because it's all about things that we cannot really pin down, and we wouldn't want to, even if we could, if you know.
Yeah. I particularly love that one line. It says, uh, by feeling our place in relation to the infinite and by inhabiting it. And this idea that we're in constant tension between sort of like closing our hearts, filming over. I think of that layer when you make pudding, and you know how you get that that hard layer on top. That's what I'm envisioning as I'm reading that. But that tension between having that filming over and then the part of us, and this is what we're talking about today, that essence, that the soul language that's trying to just constantly remove that film. It's, remove all of those hard edges and all of the deadening of the heart, as he says. And so that beautiful tension between what's inside of us and saying, no, 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 stay raw, stay innocent, stay beautiful, stay connected to God. And then all of life is like, but we want it putting layers upon layers and upon layers on top of us. So it's really amazing. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is kind of exploring how that essence, that part of us inside really speaks to us, and how it's not through regular language and the way that we communicate in our daily lives with all the people around us, but really it has its own language. And we're going to uncover that in just a moment.
That's great. I like that you gave us that jump off point, that we are basically exiting um, the linear frameworks and the literal, and getting into that more abstract realm to try and talk about things that do and don't exist. Um, this is like that blurry landscape. To me, that is really the essence of soul language. And I've got a quote by James Hillman, who's a depth psychologist, who, picking up the threads of the work of Carl Jung, and just a little quote on the soul, that the soul is a perspective rather than a substance, a viewpoint towards things rather than a thing itself. And I think if we now want to go deeper into talking about the value here, then it's knowing that there's always this temptation to want to pin things down, even when we're, as creative seekers, knowing that we are wanting to get into flow states, and there's all these different levels of flow, which doesn't seem like we want to pin things down. I still feel like there's a temptation to kind of, in moments of inspiration and clarity, it can feel so tempting to be like, oh right, this is the thing now, this is the thing. I'm working on this, or oh, this makes sense. And very quickly that thing starts to evaporate and doesn't really want to kind of offer up what it was offering just a kind of moment ago. It can be this really frustrating thing. I mean, even with the exercise that we did last week, finding the 5 people for inspiration, I was wondering how you got on with that. And we were wanting to drill in with the questions to find out what it was about those people, because there's a whole other layer we can go to. How did you get on with it?
Well, first of all, I will say, if you're just listening to this for the first time and you're like, what are they talking about? You can look up hashtag constellation on in Instagram in general, but if you go specifically to our page at the Golden Flower Podcast on Instagram, what we did, the constellation exercise is basically looking at this moment in time in your life, the 5 people that inspire you. So you think about kind of constellation, like people that are in your orbit that are, I thought of it as like, who's really nourishing me right now? Because to me, nourishment is very intimately related to inspiration. So it's hard to be inspired by something that you find void of nourishment. So
Yeah.
I it took me a little bit to try and think about this. And honestly, I probably could have come up with 7 or 8 people that really like have me on fire right now. Um, but I realized as I was going through it that there's like a group of thinkers that all sort of they kind of nourish me in the same way. And so I had 5. You were actually on it. You were the sole female to show up on my very masculine board, and which is not surprising to me. But so basically, that yeah, that's what I did. Is I kind of thought like, who gets me excited right now? Who do I want to seek out and listen to and invite their their thoughts and their information into my being. I'm a very I'm very masculine in the way that I think and approach things. And then that's the really interesting part about soul language is that I'm also an intuitive. So I don't like this word very much, but I do psychic readings. And
Mhm.
so much of that information is not coming to me as a like I'm not, it's all coming as what I call like symbolic sight. So it is really the language of the soul. And we can talk about examples in that. But so
Mm.
it's always interesting, kind of I guess those two tensions within myself that my preference is to really listen to uh, primarily male public intellectuals. That's what really interests me. And then at the same time, I really have to have that other part of my brain turned on to be able to do the readings because that comes from a completely different space.
Got some really interesting dynamics going on there, and it sounds like your constellation kind of mirrored that back to you, right? That you had um who else was on there? Just remind me, like you had.
So I had Aubrey Marcus. I have
Mhm.
the very famous producer. Um, oh my God.
Rick Rubin?
Oh,
Yeah.
Rick Rubin. Yeah, I'm like looking at his picture right now. Then I had Jordan Hall, who used to be called Jordan Greenhall, but I don't know why he changed his name. Um, and this other artist named Petey, who is a singer, but he also has these very cheesy TikTok videos that I don't watch because it takes away from his music for me. And you.
Wow. I love that I'm on there as the honorary inspiration female artist. So I mean, this exercise we tapped into it because we really wanted to see like what was, this is like thinking about we have an inner world that is kind of wanting to come out through some kind of creative form, and there's this sense of like a new cycle beginning, and so it's a really great time to check in with what's alive there. So you've got this mirror reflecting back to you kind of what you already know, that you have this really interesting tension between the masculine thinker. And perhaps just say a little more, do you mean there's a kind of systematic, like what is it that you identify that about these thinkers? What do they have in common?
So on my thing, I won't show it because it'll mess up my
Yeah.
camera. That
Mhm.
lesson before. uh, that they're sense makers and they really explore like the fabric of meaning
Right.
because in this some people call it the post-truth era, where especially now with AI and all of this, we have a problem facing humanity now with this idea of what is truth. And so there's a certain group of thinkers who have really decided to take that challenge on and say, well, how do we help people make sense of what's going on in this world when things could be fake or bots or AI generated or, any number of things. And so there is this ability that they all have. I also have Weinstein on there
Mm,
as symbolic of these types of sense-making figures. So I like that, but they're also really amazing at communicating stories and meta narratives. So they're able to look at the idea of what's going on in this time, and then again, this is a little bit of language of the soul, to be able to look at all of these things that are happening on our planet right now and weave a story together that makes sense, but also creates meaning for people that are listening. So it's
mm,
not just a regurgitation of facts, but able to kind of speak about this time as a story for humanity, and then kind of go to that next level and say, okay, if we want to write the next story, what does it look like? What do we need to include in that story that helps us bridge where we're at, which is really like a dissolution, or yeah, like a dissolution of reality, like a consensus reality. So to me, that's not only important, but it's a really beautiful skill to be able to do that.
mm. Yeah, I mean, your enthusiasm here is palpable, and I feel like what you're describing there hits on the quality of the divine masculine in terms of like their capacity to kind of self-regulate amongst all of this uncertainty and chaos, and at the same time like bring it back to that archetypal human story, so that it's that thing of like any kind of trip, you know, even if it's like taking psychedelics or something like this, it's like you can go to these realms and it takes tremendous courage to go there, but the value is, can you bring it back and talk about that experience in a way that someone else would gain the value? And it feels like you've really tuned into um, this network of men that are able to do that, and they are mirroring also your capacity to something similar. And I know just from this brief time on the podcast that there is this similar thing, you know, that of like there's like a structure and a foundation. There's a kind of willingness to go where it needs to be go, and then this kind of being able to bring it back to this the meaning and the story, so that the value can be shared and built upon, you know. There's that invitation. I feel like that community aspect is somehow really important as well. Like that's what's coming in. It's just like, let's weave this together, like, and yeah, I mean, you so when you were asking yourself what is it about this quality that's speaking to me now, and we talked about, you know, sometimes there'll just be like a light go on. Do you feel like you've already said it, or there's like a more succinct way of being like the nub sometimes we describe for this group that you had? You might
Like,
have already said it.
did I glean some more information that I didn't have prior to doing this?
Yeah, yeah, we could look at it like that. Yeah.
Uh, Again, right? Anytime you take something and make it visual and like lay it out so you can see the entirety of things, because that's what we're kind of talking about when we're talking about the language of the soul. There's a wholeness, there's an entire story embedded in a
Mm,
symbol or in an archetype. You know what I mean? Instead of it being, you talked about being linear before. And so as soon as the Gutenberg press came out and people started, it changed the way that we approach the world. Because when you read, right, you're reading in a straight line from point A to point B to point C. And when you're looking at something, especially visual, and it gives you the entirety of something, it gives you feeling, it gives you story, it gives you, it gives you logic, it gives you all of these things. So being able to see it laid out that way, it helped me understand, right? So I have Rick Rubin, nurturer of creative impulse, producer, intellectual. We have a lot of balanced divine masculine. Like I could have had balanced divine masculine under all of them. And I find you to be a very balanced divine feminine. So there was some things, there was a lot about story and blending perspectives and commentary and being able to pull multiple ideas from lots of different disciplines and pull those together and distill it into something meaningful. So that was something I was able to look at, having that whole representation in front of me.
Yeah. I mean, that was very articulate. I love the blending of perspectives, and that word balance is kind of weaving through there. The blending of perspectives, the way the hand gesture as well, and that kind of weaving into something useful. Because again, sometimes like that metaphor can be helpful sometimes. Like, you know, it doesn't have to be like a tapestry or weaving, but there's something about this interlocking, folding, pulling threads from here, there, and everywhere, and somehow that comes together into something. I don't know if you use the word useful, but like something that is like transforming the value into something. So again, like we've traveled quite far from just these people's names and what they do, and I feel like part of this exercise as well is when we can get to a kind of, not a statement, because again, it's like there is no destination. You know, there's part of us that's like, oh, I want to drill down to that bit that really gives me something and tells me something. Because I did this at the same time as you, and I actually really struggled to identify who were my 5 people, which just was really interesting for me because I've never had that problem before. But when this happened, when I did the exercise over 7 years ago, and that collection of people, it was over quite a period of months that the kind of, it was almost like having a bit of a dialogue with each of the people. I don't know, like, you know, you're very familiar with going into expanded meditative states. I think sometimes opening up a discussion, like, is there a question for them, or can you imagine them asking you a question? Sometimes even I've had the experience of like meeting someone on my list, and sometimes they being offered something like symbolic, like a gift of an object or something like that, which can be quite mysterious at the time and not really know what it means.
But I want to say something there about the
Yeah,
gift.
yeah, yeah.
That image, because often when I do guided meditations with people, and this really gets to the language of the soul, like you'll guide people through something and you'll say you'll open a chest, and in that chest is a gift. And now the way that that gift shows up, it's such a beautiful inward into what's going on inside of you, right? So the fact that you're kind of in relationship with these people on your board, that is the language of the soul, and them giving you a gift. That symbolism is a really, really beautiful piece of information that helps you glean what's going on inside of you. Inside.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like never-ending collecting clues. I like that you use the word relationship. I kind of feel this is important as well, because we have a constellation of like sources of inspiration that, you know, have these identities attached, and therefore it's kind of easy to get into dialogue. But you can also get into dialogue with the object that you were given to as a gift. Like there's always, like you say, more information to be revealed. It's about a quality of curiosity and attention which we open, and then the kind of, it's like a channel opens, and then our intuition kind of kicks in, and I like that word glean. We're able to glean more. I remember this phrase, like a state of fluent alertness. You know, the notions of soul and soul language is this. It's kind of like impossibly vast and absolutely unpinnable down. But there's a quality of attention that we can bring, and I think that's why it's great to ask, you know, once you do things like find the 5 people, ask the questions, that state of curiosity and receptivity. We're no longer in like the fixed domain. We're like really in this kind of free flow space. And this is why there's that revelation type quality going on. I mean, just briefly, I don't have to go into masses of detail about the one I did over 7 years ago, but I was able to tune into a message that was coming from within, that was something I didn't really know that I was seeking at the time. I really didn't know. So there was this thing about wanting permission for you were describing as well, the knowing about your dynamics, knowing where that tension is. So having, for me, it's like this tension between the desire for that level of expression, but also this deep introspection. And then I also got this other communication, which was I'm wrestling with a desire to be seen and unseen, you know, this whole kind of wanting the expression, but not being able to handle the vulnerability of the, you know, going beyond what I feel safe expressing and so forth with voice. And the journey of the body of work tipped me into places like I went from painting into kind of performance through painting, and I did do more things with my voice. And it was like doing that exercise gave me that reference point to kind of, I guess what I'm trying to say is these are living maps. They're not, it's not like we could do it once and leave it. I feel like this is something that is going to be alive. You know, you can come back to that constellation over and over again and work with new levels of communication and symbolism. And for me, that permission around intensity was a great gift, because it was something that was really holding me back. There was this kind of deep shame within me that I'm just too much. And I'm always trying to kind of manage myself and my intensity. Whereas this process of doing the exercise and drilling into the deeper levels gave me this kind of gift, which brought to my awareness where I was kind of working against myself. There's a challenge that we have, which is our soul is trying to call us back. Call us back or forward. There is this calling, but nothing about the fast-paced demands of life is really ever making it easy for us to hear or listen. And so these opportunities to tune in and start to learn this language, because I think, you know, I definitely feel like I'm learning all the time more about these subtleties and these signposts and these not quite this, not quite that, and learning more how to maintain that state of attention and that relationship. You use that word relationship, that there's this give and there's this take and there's this flow and there's this never-ending kind of learning that goes on. So
Yeah.
that's
One of the things I keep getting this visual that there's so much happening in the background, and we need to pay attention to what's happening in the background, because kind of like the image of the iceberg, you know, and you've got just a little bit is actually visual, and then we have this whole mass of stuff happening that is driving us and moving us towards things and pulling us back. And we need to find ways to figure out like what's happening underneath the surface. And that's, you know, this constellation exercise is just one of those things that you can do that helps you uncover. Because even stuff, you know, if you look back to the one you did 7 years ago, because we're always in this process of being and becoming, if I look at today's, there's a lot of things in there that speak to my essence, things that I would like to step into more fully, and pieces of myself that are already, I guess, more firmly planted. And being able to connect to those and bring them forward in our daily life so they aren't just working unconsciously in the background, but have the opportunity to kind of really come forward and allow us to step into, you know, who it is that we really want to be here in, you know, in this moment. So
body, yeah.
yeah, I think there's lots of ways, you know, this is just one idea, but through meditation, through hypnosis, through exploration with plant medicine, there's lots of ways to see what's going on below the surface, and being able to translate that and, bring it forward in a way that's meaningful and distill it in a way that helps us understand, I think is part of our life's work here, to be honest. And this thing is just one way to do that, but I think it's important because it does speak to that aspect of both being and becoming.
Right, nailed it. Yeah, I mean, because if I just ask you the question, like without something like this exercise, which is just one of many ways in, Angela, so what do you think is going to be the main driver for your creative life coming up? Like, you'll tell me something, and it will probably make a lot of sense, but it's very likely to be scaffolded somehow to where you've been before. It's going to make sense. Um, and it's going to be within that safety realm to some extent. I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, but it's likely to be. Whereas exactly what you were uh, describing with the icebergs, just like all of this beneath the surface is wanting to become available, but there's an attunement that we need to kind of cultivate if we're going to ever be able to access and make use of, I don't know, make use, but like allow in all these elements that really want to work with us and support us. And yeah, you said it really well. What was the last line? The being and the becoming, was it?
Yeah, being
Yeah.
and becoming.
Yeah.
I'd like to do a whole episode on that because I think there's also that tension between when we do self-improvement work and this idea of how do you love yourself where you stand, but also realize that there's things that you would like to shift, but we won't get into that. So after this very short break, we're going to dive into next week's creative challenge. So if you're like us and you enjoy different frameworks and exercises and creative self exploration, stick around and listen to what we have for you next week. So this is the segment here where we explore frameworks and explore different ways to connect to our creative core. And so last week we did constellation exercise. And this week we're going to do sort of the mirror version of this, which I think is really cool. So I'm going to let you introduce that.
Yeah, well, we've gained a lot, even though it's just kind of like just the beginning of what's pulling us forward. And there's all this kind of excitement and, you know, this sense of possibility. I think it's also interesting and kind of essential to know what might be pulling us in the opposite direction, or like what might be the obstacle, because there's always a counterbalance for the uh, wherever there's inspiration, there's going to be resistance, there's going to be the pushback. And you know, we have so many conversations about the creative life and what it takes, and it always comes back to how we kind of manage resistance. So it's if we know who's on the inspiration team, it's kind of also interesting to find out who might be on the resistance team. And that's what this exercise is. It's just kind of like reversing, is that the word? Yeah, having a look in the other direction. And I mean, when it comes to the realm of shadow and resistance, there are just so many ways you can go. For me, personally, the fast track is always just to get into where's the judgment. The judgment will just deliver you head on straight away. Bam! This is this is it, and it will get you to those raw places very quickly. Sometimes there's an availability with who you've identified already, because sometimes even though we might be really inspired by someone and their work, we can also acknowledge that there is some bits that we don't jive with and that there's some judgment there. But sometimes we're a bit blind to that because we're just so into their work and what they're offering that it doesn't really sit very well. But there's plenty of judgment. All we have to do is think about like what really irritates us, winds us up, gets adrenaline flowing. Then we've got a pretty fast track to who might be on our resistance constellation. Are you with me? And again,
And I'm thinking, in relationship to the idea of the language of the soul, that this for me will be more fruitful. Like there'll be a lot more uncovering in this.
Mhm.
I can already, even for example, you said like Aubrey Marcus, he also annoys me a little bit, actually quite a bit. Like I had to, sift through quite a bit of like quite a few different photos because there was a lot of really douchey photos of him, like doing like
Mhm.
flexing his muscles and just
Mhm.
silliness there's this whole bro dude aspect to him that kind of drives me
Mhm.
crazy. And so I'm excited to explore that. So the first one is hashtag constellation. This one will be shadow constellation or
Yeah,
resistance.
shadow. I think shadow's good. Shadow's good because we get to the resistance from going into the shadow. So, I mean, ultimately, what's great about taking this journey is whatever we can locate, it is going to have super powerful gifts because there's a way of working with what we find in the shadow domain that is incredible. We've used that metaphor of the iceberg of like what we see on the surface and what's underneath. There is nothing like shadow work to release and bring on board vast reservoirs of energy that are working against us that could be working for us. It just takes a lot of courage and raw, naked honesty to make sure that you really collide head on with those parts. So yeah, that will be exciting to get into, and it will be a similar thing. It's just like, just come up with the five. If they're not it might be a mixture of people that have already made it onto the first mind map, or completely new.
I like what you're saying, like getting at like who do you judge, who do you find annoying, maybe
Mm-hmm.
somebody, and correct me if I'm wrong here, if there was somebody that you were very very much into and now you just find them um
That's an interesting one. Yeah. Someone that you're like, no, not anymore. Like, what is it? What was their fall from grace? There'll be some juice there. Yeah, that's a good one. I hadn't thought of that. It's it's enough just to be like, I used to really rate this person, now all of a sudden I don't. Like, what's the difference? There'll be lots of interesting things there. Or just I can't stand this performer, artist, or whatever it is. And then we've got to get straight away into the reason.
Yeah. So if there's somebody that really turns you off that's in the public domain or even in your life, but I probably won't share that on
Yeah,
this.
it's maybe better, safer for this one to go a bit further afield. And also, like, the projection can be, it's less complicated. I feel like when we do that further afield thing, it's like cleaner. It's cleaner somehow. It's just like, no, I don't like that, and then we can just free flow about it.
Yes. Kind of like
Mm.
the ability to step back and witness in meditation, right? Like it makes it a little more impersonal. So you can be a little bit more objective.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, this is really about being uncensored. We don't want to be like, I'm judging myself for judging. No, we're not trying to be good people here. No, we're trying to, ultimately, there's going to be a process which is to kind of alchemize what we find here to bring um, the gifts of the shadow on board, which is the supercharger ultimately. I mean, inspiration is a huge part of this, but I think there is probably the same amount, if not more, energy wrapped up in the shadow dimension. And so, yeah, when thinking about beginning new cycles, like you say, gleaning more information and being able to work with ourselves in ever more flexible, interesting ways, thinking about wanting to really nudge more and more towards that coming homeness, towards that potential, whatever it is. We need everything. It's that 360 perspective if that's going to start to happen. So let it
Well,
be on. Let's do it.
these episodes are supposed to be standalone episodes, but if you're interested in following the journey, or perhaps you listen to this, a year from now, do check out hashtag constellation. So that's the exercise from last week, and this week will be hashtag shadow constellation. And follow us at the Golden Flower Podcast. You can see we post all of the stuff, the exercises, because a lot of them are very visual, on our Instagram page, as well as you can find our podcast anywhere podcasts are hosted, and check out our YouTube channel at the Golden Flower. Well, the next episode, we are going to talk about resistance at the precipice. Now, as creatives, resistance is a theme that we have to cycle through over and over, but specifically we're talking about, like, when you're in it, when you've started and you're trying to persevere. And especially, like, as we thought about putting this podcast out, like right before we had to start, both of us ran into some really interesting resistance that we will share in our next episode. So for now, follow the aliveness, nurture that spark, and have a great week.